fibers still clinging to its bark. For Margaret, it was already a landmark, proof that dignity could be bruised but not broken. News spread quickly. The reporters' photographs made their way to regional outlets, then to state papers. By noon, the headline read, "Decorated General humiliated by police, community demands answers." The story wouldn't be buried now, not with images too stark to ignore. Within days, the state announced a hearing. Oversight officials would review the actions of the officers and the role of Robert Lang. It wasn't yet justice, but it was a doorway. Margaret found herself summoned as a witness. She'd never stood in a courtroom before, never spoken beyond diner chatter, but she knew she couldn't refuse. Her Polaroid photographs, grainy but undeniable, had become part of the record. The hearing hall was packed. Rows of townsfolk filled the benches. Some veterans in faded uniforms, others ordinary citizens who had felt the sting of humiliation in smaller ways. Soldiers from Collins's unit sat in disciplined silence, their presence alone a reminder that loyalty could outlast politics. Margaret sat nervously at the front, clutching her photographs. Her palms sweated, but when her name was called, she rose with quiet determination. "State your name," the chairperson instructed. "Margaret Hayes," she answered, her voice steadier than she expected. "And your occupation?" "I'm a waitress," she said, then paused, adding, "and I was there that night." A ripple of murmurs passed through the room. Margaret drew a breath and began. She told them of the sirens without sound, of Collins dragged into the lot, of the ropes biting into her arms. She spoke of silence broken only by cruelty, of a deputy's smirk inside the diner, of the officer's laughter outside. Her voice cracked once, but she pressed on. "Why did you step outside?" One board member asked. Margaret held up the Polaroid. "Because silence would have been another rope." The hall grew still. Even Lang, seated stiffly across the room, shifted uncomfortably. The reporter followed with his testimony, presenting sharper photographs that captured Collins against the oak. His words were less practiced, but his images spoke volumes. Each flash had preserved the cruelty the officers had hoped would vanish with the dark. Then came Collins. The general entered with a quiet strength, her uniform pressed, her insignia gleaming. She moved with the poise of someone who had faced greater storms and survived. When she spoke, her voice carried, not loud but steady, unflinching. "I served this country for 30 years. I know what it means to follow rules, to uphold order. But what was done to me that night was not order. It was abuse." She paused, letting the words sink. "And it wasn't just done to me. It was done to every soldier who ever trusted that their service meant dignity. It was done to every citizen who believes authority must answer to law, not whim." Her words struck like arrows. Veterans in the audience nodded, some wiping their eyes. Townsfolk straightened in their seats, pride and outrage mingling. Lang tried to respond, his voice smooth. His arguments wrapped in talk of misunderstandings and classified protocols. But each word landed thinner, less convincing. The photographs, the testimonies, Collins's unshakable presence, they stacked against him like stones in a wall. The officers themselves faltered under questioning. Their stories shifted, excuses tangled. When finally admitted, "We thought it would teach her a lesson," the hall erupted in murmurs. The chairperson's gavel struck wood. "A lesson." Collins's eyes narrowed. "Discipline isn't humiliation. Justice isn't cruelty. If you strip dignity from service, you strip the very foundation you claim to protect." The soldiers behind her rose as one, not with weapons but with silence, their bodies aligned in solidarity. It was a gesture so profound, the entire room hushed. Margaret felt her chest swell. She realized she wasn't just watching history, she was part of it. Her photographs, her voice, her small act of defiance had rippled outward until the truth filled this hall. The board recessed for deliberation. The room buzzed, tension high. Margaret sat beside Collins, her hands folded tightly. "You were brave," Collins said quietly. Margaret shook her head. "I was scared." "Bravery isn't the absence of fear," Collins replied. "It's choosing to act anyway." Margaret looked into her eyes, seeing not just a soldier, but a human being who had carried burdens far heavier than rope. She nodded, a lump in her throat. When the board returned, the verdict was read. The officers were stripped of their badges pending criminal charges. Robert Lang was placed under independent investigation. New guidelines for civilian oversight of law enforcement were announced, effective immediately. The hall erupted, not in chaos, but in applause. Relief, dignity, justice. It washed over the crowd like sunrise. Collins remained calm, though her eyes softened. She extended her hand to Margaret, who took it with trembling fingers. "This isn't just my victory," Collins said. "It's ours. Every voice that spoke, every truth that stood tall." Margaret blinked back tears. "I only did what anyone should have done," Collins smiled faintly. "Maybe, but you actually did it." For Margaret, the words lit something deep inside, a reminder that even small voices could tip the balance when spoken at the right moment. As the hall emptied, townsfolk stopped to thank her, veterans saluted Collins, and the young reporter clutched his camera like a weapon turned toward light. The battle wasn't over. Reforms would take time, and scars would remain, but the arc had bent toward justice. And Margaret knew the oak tree outside her diner would forever carry two stories, one of humiliation and one of defiance that turned humiliation into change. The town changed after that hearing. Not overnight, not with fanfare, but with the slow steadiness of people remembering what dignity looked like when tested. Margaret felt it every day at the diner. Folks spoke softer, kinder. The same three men who had once argued endlessly over baseball now paused sometimes to ask, "How's Collins doing?" Veterans who had sat in silence for years began telling their stories aloud. No longer ashamed of scars carried home, Collins herself returned to a quieter life. Though quiet never quite described her presence. She came to the diner often, always sitting at the booth near the window that faced the oak tree. Margaret would bring her coffee, black, no sugar, and they'd talk. Not about the night itself, not directly. Collins preferred reflection to reliving. One evening, as the autumn sun slanted gold across the lot, Collins tapped the table with a small box. "For you," she said simply. Margaret hesitated before opening it. Inside lay a medal, polished and gleaming, its ribbon neatly folded. "I can't take this," Margaret whispered, her throat tight. Collins shook her head. "It isn't mine anymore. That night, when they tied me up, I thought I'd been stripped of everything I stood for. But you reminded me dignity doesn't come from brass or ceremony. It comes from the courage to act when silence would be easier. This belongs with you." Margaret blinked hard, tears threatening. "I just did what anyone should have done." Collins smiled faintly. "Maybe, but you actually did it." Margaret closed the box gently, pressing it to her chest. She thought of the flash of her Polaroid, the trembling in her hands, the way Collins's eyes had met hers through the glass that night. A waitress and a general, bound by a single act of witness. The oak tree remained, scarred but standing. Some in town wanted it cut down, calling it a reminder of shame. But Collins argued otherwise. "We don't erase what happened," she said at a town meeting. "We honor it by remembering." In time, a small plaque was placed at its roots, dignity restored here. Margaret sometimes saw children stop to read it, their voices stumbling over the big words, but their faces solemn. The officers faced trial. Some pleaded guilty, others fought bitterly, but none returned to the badge. Robert Lang resigned quietly, slipping into obscurity. The reforms announced at the hearing took shape. New oversight boards, clearer procedures, stricter accountability. Progress was slow, but it was something. Collins reminded Margaret often, "Justice is rarely swift, but it leaves stronger roots when it grows steady." For Margaret, life settled back into its rhythms, coffee pots, pie slices, jukebox tunes. Yet she carried herself differently now. People noticed. She wasn't just the waitress anymore. She was the one who spoke up. And while she never sought the title, she wore it with quiet pride. One night, near closing, Collins lingered as Margaret wiped down tables. The diner was empty, save for the hum of the neon sign. Do you ever wonder why they chose that tree? Collins asked suddenly. Margaret paused, cloth in hand. I think they wanted to make you small. A tree's older than all of us, strong, rooted. Tying you there was their way of saying even nature would bear witness to your humiliation. Collins nodded slowly. And yet it became the opposite. That tree stood taller than their cruelty. It saw dignity outlast shame. Margaret set the cloth down, her eyes softening. It's strange, isn't it? How something meant to break you became a reminder of strength. Collins sipped her coffee, then smiled faintly. Life has a way of turning symbols inside out. What matters is who holds the memory. Cops humiliate a general by tying her to a tree. Then, her whole military arrives. What if a quiet evening at a small-town diner turned into the kind of story people whisper about for years? The kind where ordinary folks suddenly find themselves standing at the edge of something bigger than they ever imagined. That night, the neon sign above the window hummed faintly, casting a pink glow on the chipped counter where Margaret, a waitress in her late 30s, refilled coffee cups with the easy rhythm of someone who had done this for half her life. She thought it would be just another shift, pie slices, small talk, and the same three men arguing over baseball. But then, through the glass doors, she saw the headlights of police cruisers rolling slow, their sirens muted like hunters circling quiet prey. Margaret didn't yet know what they carried in the back, or who. But what she witnessed next would change everything. Where are you watching from tonight? The cruiser doors opened in unison, and 4 officers stepped out, their boots hitting the gravel with heavy purpose. Margaret set the coffee pot back on its warmer, her hand tightening unconsciously around the handle. The men at the counter stopped their chatter. Even the jukebox mid-song seemed quieter. The officers didn't come in. They headed instead toward the patch of trees just beyond the edge of the diner's lot, flashlights cutting thin beams through the branches. Margaret leaned forward, curiosity tugging at her. In this town, police usually made their presence known with a swagger, busting through the diner for coffee, joking loud enough to claim the room. Tonight, they carried silence like a weapon. She felt the unease ripple through the other patrons. Old Mr. Harris, who never missed his nightly slice of peach pie, muttered, "Something's off. They don't move that way unless they've already decided who's guilty." She tried to shake it off, but then she saw it. The officers dragged someone out of the shadows. A woman, tall, broad-shouldered, though her frame sagged with exhaustion. Her uniform was muddied, torn at the sleeve. Margaret squinted, catching the glint of polished brass still pinned stubbornly to her chest. A military insignia. The diner gasped as one. The air sucked clean from the room. "That's General Collins," whispered a trucker by the window. "His fork froze mid-air. Retired, but what on earth are they doing with her?" Margaret knew the name. Everyone did. Collins was respected, the kind of figure school teachers spoke of when they wanted kids to believe in discipline and sacrifice. She had commanded troops overseas, returned with honor, and built a quiet life just outside town. To see her now, hands bound cruelly behind her back, her chin lifted in defiance even as dirt streaked her cheek, something in Margaret's chest cracked. The officers didn't march her into the station. They led her to the oak tree at the corner of the lot. Its roots pushed through the gravel like bones, and Margaret had spent many mornings watching sparrows hop along its branches. But now, under the harsh beam of flashlights, the tree seemed something else entirely, an execution post in the middle of a town that had forgotten itself. "Are they really?" Margaret couldn't finish the sentence. One officer looped a coarse rope around Collins's wrists and hauled it up against the trunk. Another shoved her shoulder until her back smacked against the bark. Collins winced but made no sound. "They're tying her to the tree," Mr. Harris breathed, as if saying it aloud might make it untrue. Margaret felt her throat tighten. She knew humiliation when she saw it. This wasn't an arrest. This wasn't justice. It was theater, meant to degrade, to strip away dignity in front of watchful eyes. The diner had grown restless. People shifted in their booths, caught between fear and outrage. No one wanted to move first. The officers' voices carried faintly through the glass. Thought you were untouchable, huh? One sneered. Where's that pride now, General? Another mocked. Collins stood silent. She didn't spit back, didn't beg. She only fixed her gaze forward, unflinching, as if daring the world to witness her humiliation and remember it. Margaret's fingers dug into the counter. She thought of her father, a veteran who used to tell her, respect isn't about the medals. It's about how you hold yourself when no one else will. Collins was holding herself now, but Margaret feared even steel had limits. The doorbell above the diner door jingled. Everyone flinched. A young deputy had come inside, scanning the room. His hand rested lazily on his holster. Evening, folks, he said, his smile thin and sharp. Best stay put. Nothing for you to see out there. Margaret felt the room stiffen. The deputy lingered, as if daring anyone to argue. She glanced around. Eyes avoided his. Heads dipped low. People who had cheered Collins's parades years ago now folded into silence, afraid of drawing the same wrath. When the deputy finally left, the air loosened, but only slightly. Margaret moved quickly to the window, her heart racing. She had to see. Collins's head tipped back now against the trunk. The rope dug harshly into her arms, leaving red marks visible even from a distance. The officers laughed among themselves, cigarettes glowing in the dark, as if this were nothing more than a cruel pastime. Margaret pressed her hand against the glass. Whispering, "This isn't right," behind her, the trucker spoke again. "They don't know what they're messing with." His voice carried both awe and warning. Margaret turned to him. "What do you mean?" He lowered his fork, finally setting it aside. "You think a general walks alone? Even retired? She's got people, loyal people. You humiliate someone like her in public, you're not just tying up one woman. You're challenging everything she stood for. The military doesn't take kindly to seeing their own treated like dogs." Margaret's breath caught. She looked again at Collins, at the unbreakable line of her jaw, at the stillness she carried like a final act of defiance. And for the first time, she wondered if the tree the officers had chosen as a stage might soon become their undoing. The headlights of another car cut across the lot, and everyone in the diner froze. This wasn't another cruiser. The engine was heavier, the hum deeper. Margaret's pulse jumped. Something had shifted in the night. The officers turned their heads toward the road, their laughter dimming. Collins's lips curved, almost imperceptibly, into the shadow of a smile. The rumble grew louder, steady and deliberate, until a long black SUV pulled into the lot. Its headlights carved through the mist, scattering across the oak tree where Collins stood bound. The officers stiffened. Cigarettes dropped, crushed quickly under boots. Margaret watched from the diner window, her palms damp with nervous sweat. Something in the air had changed, and everyone felt it. The SUV door opened, and out stepped a man in a plain suit. He wasn't law enforcement, not with the way his shoes shined, not with the calm authority in his stride. He adjusted his tie and approached the scene without hesitation. "What's your business here?" One of the officers barked, trying to sound larger than his shrinking confidence. The man stopped only a few feet away, hands clasped behind his back. "My business," he said evenly, "is with General Collins." His voice carried with the weight of command, as though he had long ago learned to speak across battlefields. Collins's chin lifted. Recognition flickered in her eyes, and for the first time that night, her shoulders eased. The officer spat to the side. "She's under arrest." "For what charge?" the man asked. His tone was not aggressive, merely precise. Silence followed. One officer muttered, "Disorderly conduct." The man raised an eyebrow. "Disorderly conduct warrants tying a decorated veteran to a tree. In front of civilians." He gestured toward the diner where faces pressed to glass. "Be careful. Some humiliations don't stay buried." Margaret's heart thudded. She glanced around the diner. People shifted nervously, whispering. Someone said, "Is he military too?" Another answered, "Looks higher up. Intelligence, maybe." The officers bristled, but didn't answer. Finally, one of them snarled, "Get lost! This isn't your concern." The man studied them for a long moment, then turned his gaze back to Collins. "Hold fast," he told her quietly, almost reverently. "Help is coming." Then he returned to his SUV, climbing in with unhurried grace. Within moments, the taillights vanished into the night. Margaret exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The diner buzzed with speculation now. Who was he? What did he mean, help is coming? Even old Mr. Harris, who usually avoided gossip, murmured, "Mark my words, this isn't over." Outside, the officers tried to laugh off the encounter. Though their voices were sharper, their glances more anxious. One of them kicked at the gravel. Another muttered, "Let's just keep her here until morning." But their bravado had cracked. Margaret could see it. She turned her eyes back to Collins. Despite the ropes digging cruelly into her arms, the general stood taller now. Her silence was no longer resignation. It was endurance, a soldier waiting for the signal she knew would come. The hours dragged. Midnight crept closer. The diner emptied slowly, though Margaret couldn't bring herself to leave. Something compelled her to stay, to bear witness. She brewed fresh coffee for the few who remained, their eyes heavy but restless. And then, just when the lull threatened to settle, another sound broke the stillness. A low, synchronized hum. Not one engine this time, many. Margaret stepped closer to the glass, her heart climbing into her throat. From the highway came a convoy, first one, then 3, then 5 military vehicles rolling in formation. Their headlights cut sharp through the dark, their engines steady as a drumbeat. "Oh, my lord," whispered the trucker. He pushed back from his stool and stood. "That's not just help. That's the cavalry." The diner filled with movement as patrons scrambled for a better view. The officers outside cursed under their breath, their confidence unraveling as the convoy turned deliberately into the lot. The vehicles stopped in a perfect line. Soldiers stepped out, their uniforms crisp even under the haze of night. They moved with discipline, no wasted motion, no hesitation. And at their center stood a woman in her 50s, her hair silver at the temples, her presence commanding. She spoke with a voice that cut through the cool air like steel. "Release General Collins now!" Margaret's breath hitched. This was no stranger. This was command meeting command. One officer scoffed nervously, hand twitching toward his radio. "You've got no jurisdiction here," he stammered. The silver-haired woman stepped forward, her soldiers flanking her like shadows. "You've humiliated an officer who gave her life to service. You've tied her to a tree as if she were a criminal without charge." Her tone sharpened. "Do you think the world won't hear of this? Do you think history won't remember?" The lot fell silent, but for the rustle of leaves. Collins's eyes closed briefly, as if drawing strength from the words. Margaret could feel her own pulse racing. She whispered to herself, "Justice is coming." The officers shifted, their bravado dissolving entirely under the weight of disciplined soldiers staring them down. One tried to mutter a protest, but his voice broke halfway. Another glanced at his partner, silently begging for direction. And then, in a desperate attempt to reclaim authority, the lead officer shouted, "Stand down! This is police business. You've got no right to interfere." The silver-haired woman's eyes narrowed. "We have every right to defend dignity when it's being stripped before the eyes of your own community." She gestured toward the diner, where faces peered wide-eyed through glass. "You forget that authority isn't given, it's entrusted. And tonight you've betrayed that trust." Margaret gripped the counter, her knuckles white. She'd never seen arrogance so thoroughly dismantled by truth alone. The soldiers didn't raise weapons. They didn't shout. They only stood, silent and immovable, their presence more powerful than any show of force. It was a discipline born of loyalty, a loyalty Collins had earned. Collins opened her eyes again, and this time they locked with Margaret's through the glass. For a fleeting moment, Margaret felt included, as though her quiet witness mattered in this unfolding reckoning. The night reached a fever pitch. Fear, defiance, hope. They swirled together until the air itself seemed ready to snap, and just as the lead officer opened his mouth to spit another order, the sharp wail of a camera flash pierced the night. Margaret turned and saw it. A young reporter had arrived, notebook in hand. Camera raised. The officers paled. "Evidence," Margaret whispered. "Now the world will know." Collins smiled faintly, her dignity shining through bruises and rope. The stage was no longer controlled by her captors. The balance had shifted. The reporter's flashbulb lit up the night like lightning, freezing the scene in stark white. Margaret flinched, shielding her eyes, but when her vision cleared, she saw the change immediately. The officers stiffened, their bravado crumbling under the weight of documentation. No longer was this cruelty confined to whispers in a small-town diner. Now there would be proof that could outlive the night. Put that camera down. One officer barked, storming toward the reporter, but the young man held his ground. "Freedom of the press," he said firmly, though his voice wavered. "The public has a right to know." The officer reached for the camera, but a soldier stepped between them, calm yet unyielding. "He's not breaking any law," the soldier said. "Touch him and you'll answer for it." The air bristled, a fragile wire stretched taut. Margaret felt her stomach twist. She knew how quickly tempers could ignite, and here they stood at the edge of violence. Her eyes flicked back to Collins. Bound, bruised, and silent, the general bore it all with composure. But Margaret could see the tremor in her arms, the faint quiver in her jaw. Even steel bends under strain. For a heartbeat, Margaret wished Collins would scream, rage, lash out, anything to release the unbearable pressure. But Collins only closed her eyes, and Margaret understood. This was her strength, restraint, dignity, refusing to let her captors dictate her legacy. Margaret whispered under her breath. "Hold on!" Inside the diner, the tension spread like wildfire. Some patrons wanted to rush out, to stand beside Collins and the soldiers. Others urged caution. Mr. Harris shook his head. "If townsfolk get involved, it'll be chaos. Let the uniforms handle it. But what if they don't?" Margaret asked. Her voice carried more bite than she intended, silencing the booth beside her. The trucker spoke low. "She needs witnesses as much as soldiers. If they bury this, it's our word against theirs." Margaret nodded, her resolve firming. She grabbed the old Polaroid camera that hung near the counter, a relic she kept for tourists who liked snapshots with their pie. Tonight, it had a greater purpose. She stepped outside, her knees weak but steadying with each breath. The gravel crunched beneath her shoes. Heads turned. The officer's eyes narrowed, but the soldiers' gazes softened, offering silent encouragement. Margaret raised the camera, hands trembling, and snapped a picture of Collins bound against the tree. The flash cracked the darkness again. "Ma'am, go back inside," one officer ordered harshly. Margaret's voice shook but carried. "Not until you release her." The lot fell silent. For a moment, even the cicadas seemed to hush. The officer stared at her, then scoffed. "You think anyone will believe a waitress with a camera?" She swallowed, fear clawing at her, but she didn't lower the camera. "They'll believe the truth," she said simply. The soldiers exchanged glances. Collins's eyes opened, finding Margaret's, and something unspoken passed between them. Acknowledgement, gratitude, maybe even kinship. The silver-haired officer stepped forward, her presence a steady anchor. "This is over," she declared. "Untie her, now." But just then, another set of headlights swept the lot. A different car this time, sleek, official with government plates. Margaret's chest tightened. Out stepped a man in a tailored suit carrying a briefcase. His hair was immaculate, his smile polished but hollow. "Enough," he said smoothly, raising a hand. "This has gone far enough." The officers exhaled with relief, as if their savior had arrived. The soldiers stiffened. Margaret frowned. Who was he? He introduced himself as Robert Lang, liaison for the state's Department of Public Safety. His voice was oily, measured. "I've been briefed. There's been a misunderstanding. Let's de-escalate, shall we? General Collins will be taken into custody quietly. No further spectacle." The soldiers bristled. The silver-haired commander spoke sharply. "Custody? On what grounds?" Lang smiled thinly. "National security, classified. I'll handle it." Margaret's blood ran cold. She knew a cover-up when she heard one. She thought of her father's words. When they say classified, sometimes they mean buried. The reporter stepped forward nervously. "Sir, I've already taken photographs." "The public deserves." Lang cut him off with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Photographs can be misplaced. Careers can be redirected. I advise you to think carefully about your future." The young man faltered, his courage flickering. Margaret felt anger surge hot in her chest. She stepped closer, her voice clear. You can't erase what we've all seen tonight. You can't erase her dignity. Lang turned to her, amused. And who might you be? A waitress, she said firmly, but also a witness. And you'll have to silence a whole town if you want to bury this. For a flicker, Lang's smile cracked. His eyes hardened. But before he could respond, Collins spoke for the first time that night. Her voice was hoarse but steady. Robert Lang, still cleaning up other people's messes, I see. Every head turned. Lang paled. Margaret's breath caught. Collins knew him. You think you can silence loyalty? Loyalty doesn't answer to you, Collins said, her words heavy with earned authority. These people, she glanced toward Margaret, the reporter, the diners, they've seen what you've tried to hide. That truth will outlast you, the soldiers straightened. The townsfolk inside pressed closer to the glass. Even the reporter regained his footing, raising his camera higher. Lang's composure faltered further. He adjusted his tie, voice clipped now. Untie her. We'll handle this, formally. The officers hesitated, torn between fear of the soldiers and obedience to Lang. Finally, grudgingly, one moved to loosen the rope. The knots came undone slowly, the rope sliding off with a hiss against bark. Collins' arms dropped, red and raw, but she stood tall, her back unbowed. Margaret felt tears sting her eyes. The silver-haired commander stepped closer, steadying Collins by the elbow. She spoke softly but firmly. You're safe now. We'll see this through, Lang muttered under his breath. This isn't over. No, Collins replied, her voice cutting the air. It's just beginning. Margaret knew then that the night's humiliation was only the opening act. What came next would be hearings, oversight, accountability. A fight not just for one woman's dignity, but for the principle of justice itself. The turning point had come. The ropes were gone, but the real struggle had only begun. Morning light cast long shadows across the diner parking lot, as if the town itself hadn't slept. The oak tree stood scarred rope. They sat in companionable silence. Two women bound by an extraordinary night neither had chosen, but both had endured. Outside, the oak's branches swayed gently, its leaves whispering in the evening breeze. As weeks turned into months, Margaret sometimes walked past the oak alone. She'd press her hand against its rough bark, feeling the grooves where rope once bit deep. It grounded her, reminded her that even ordinary lives could bend history in small but vital ways. The Polaroid camera still hung in the diner, though now it bore a note taped above it, "Never underestimate a witness." Customers chuckled at it, but Margaret knew its weight. Sometimes she caught Collins glancing at it too, a quiet smile playing at her lips. The young reporter who had risked his camera that night went on to write a series of articles about abuse of authority. His career flourished, but he always credited his courage back to a waitress with a Polaroid. Margaret blushed when she read it, shaking her head, but Collins only laughed. Ripples, Margaret. You started Ripples. Years later, when the plaque at the oak grew weathered, townsfolk came together to restore it. Margaret stood back, watching as children painted the words fresh, their laughter carrying across the lot. She thought of Collins, of the medal still tucked safely in her drawer, of the night she chose action over silence, and she felt peace. Collins once told her, "Authority isn't given, it's entrusted." Margaret thought of that often. She thought of how power could corrupt, but also how ordinary people could steady it when it wavered. She thought of how humiliation could be turned into dignity, not by vengeance, but by truth. On a quiet Sunday morning, Margaret unlocked the diner early, letting the sunlight spill across the counter. She placed the medal on the windowsill, where the light caught it, scattering soft reflections onto the walls. It was her way of keeping the story alive, not as a burden, but as a beacon. She poured herself a cup of coffee and sat by the window, watching the oak sway gently in the breeze. And she smiled, not because the world was perfect, but because she'd learned it could be better when someone, anyone, chose to stand. Her final thought drifted like a prayer. Dignity doesn't bow to rope. Justice doesn't vanish in the dark. And even the smallest witness can tip the scales toward light. The neon sign buzzed faintly, the coffee steam curled upward, and Margaret closed her eyes for a moment, letting peace settle deep in her chest. If this story touched your heart, give it a like, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more stories that honor dignity, justice, and hope.